May the words of my lips and the meditation of our hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, it's easy to forget that we are still in the season of Epiphany, which began almost 2 months ago on January the 6th. Epiphany is one of those mystical seasons, a time when the truth of God is revealed in new and surprising ways. And it's a season when we are asked to fall in love with what we have come to know about this God. So we think of Epiphany as a season of light. It all comes from that original star that guided the Magi, the astrologers and philosophers from the East. They got that star that guided them is kind of the theme of Epiphany. They took this group of 3 Magi to an unknown poor child lying in a Bethlehem manger. We know that story really well. Those Magi discovered in that child a new light, a new wisdom, a new hope that surpasses anything they could have ever discovered about God and the world on their own. It was a revelation of the mystery of God. And then next, on the following Sunday in Epiphany, we get John baptizing the grown-up Jesus. And at that moment, as Jesus identified with sinners, the curtain lifts and we hear that Jesus is God's cherished child, that God is so pleased with him. All the light of God, the promised light of so long ago, is found in him. And that light continues to unfold Sunday by Sunday throughout the weeks of Epiphany. Our eyes behold the glory of God's light when Jesus turns water into wine at the wedding in Cana in Galilee. And then the gospel story turns to the day Jesus shows up in his hometown and reads from the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue. He tells them that everything that Isaiah foresees, the good news for the poor, the release of the captives, the sight for the blind, is present and active now in their congregation in him. The light of God shines this very day. And that light keeps spilling out, leaking, revealing the overflowing abundance of God week by week. There's the miracle of Jesus out in the boat, telling his disciples to let down their nets, and when they do, it's a miraculous catch of fish. And then the gospel takes us to Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, where he says, the hungry, the poor, the sad are blessed, and the rich, the famous, the powerful are cursed. You think you'll find light in success, in worldly wisdom. But instead, Jesus challenges us to see God's light in the ones we often overlook, the ones we often reject. And next Sunday, the last Sunday after Epiphany, before we shift into that season of Lent, we will experience a disorienting moment atop of a mountain. There, the disciples will see Jesus overcome by light as he is transfigured into the glory of God. They are blinded by the brightness and so amazed and so enthralled that they wish they could remain forever enveloped in that great transforming light. And so the theme of Epiphany is light, that mysterious light that beckons us to follow. We watch Jesus call people who want this light, who are compelled by this light. We watch him teach and heal and perform miracles, revealing God's light, God's character, God's intentions for all humanity. We see the light that shines in Jesus' life, how it lifts people from the shadows of despair and violence and injustice. Sunday by Sunday, the light of Epiphany forever reveals something new. And there's light in today's gospel reading from Luke 2, even if it might not at first be so obvious. Jesus is teaching something that at first doesn't feel much like light. It's a difficult lesson because it's essentially an attack on the values of our prevailing culture. The things we think are normal and reasonable turn out to be foolish. And conversely, what seems to be weak and downright dumb in the eyes of the world shows up in the light of God to be the way of wisdom and righteousness. Today's gospel reading gives us several examples of this reversal of values. Don't we all like to hate our enemies? Your hatred feels justified, doesn't it? I mean, if you can't hate your enemy, then who can you hate? But no, Jesus says, love your enemies. There's nothing more satisfying than getting back or settling a score or getting even. Revenge is so sweet. But no, Jesus says, do good to those who hate you. I'll pray for you if I like you, for sure. Maybe God really does bless all of my friends and family, only the people who think like me and act like me. But no, Jesus says, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. If someone takes your cloak, give him your shirt too. If you lend something out and don't get it back, well, just let it go. Sounds outrageous, doesn't it? It certainly sounds naive and unrealistic. Are we ready to fall in love with this teaching? Because that's what we're asked to do 2,000 years later and countless wars later. The pages of history strewn with untold enemies, endless corruption, self-serving tyrants, brutal realities, and the hard truths of life. Just when I thought my dad and his generation defeated the Nazis, here they are again, so close to home. It's a lot of darkness. And Jesus is no stranger to darkness. He's as wise as a serpent, even as he's gentle as a dove. He's not gullible or naive or so idealistic that his head is forever in the clouds. But he does listen to a different drummer. He follows the beat of different music altogether. As the old hymn says, he hears the far-off hymn that hails a new creation. He was convinced that God would bring in a reign of peace, and everything he said and did, everything he taught and lived was an expression of this vision of a new earth, a new way of being, a new reign of peace. His teaching was light. In God's reign, there will be no violence, and former enemies will be joined in love and reconciliation. In God's reign, words of cursing and condemnation will be overcome by blessing and forgiveness. And isn't this something that we can love? Isn't this something we can choose? Isn't this something that captures our hearts and imagination? This is another revelation of light that so many of us desperately need. When hatreds and divisions and threats come our way, are you willing to pause and wonder, what does the light require of me now? Father Greg Boyle tells the story of Pedro in his book, Tattoos of the Heart. Greg Boyle is well known for his work with gang members in Los Angeles and for starting Homeboy Industries to provide work and encouragement for anyone who wants to get out of gangs. Pedro is exactly the kind of person Father Boyle works with. As a young kid, Pedro got caught up in gang life on the streets of the most dangerous parts of LA. For most of his life, he was filled with rage and resentment, and like so many others, he turned to heavy drinking and eventually crack cocaine to cover it all up. Whenever Father Boyle saw Pedro on the streets, he would offer to take him to rehab. But every time Pedro would gently decline. "Thanks, G, but I'm okay," he would say. But one day, Pedro changed his answer and got in the car that took him down the long, hard road of getting his life back together. 30 days into rehab, Pedro's younger brother, caught up in similar demons, did the unthinkable. He took his own life. The world around him was just too much to handle. When Father Boyle called Pedro with the news, of course, Pedro was distraught, devastated. But now that he was 30 days sober and thinking with a clear head and feeling with a clear heart, he allowed the pain to settle into his core, instead of putting it in some corner to fester. When Father Boyle arrived at the rehab center to take Pedro to the funeral, they didn't speak. But before Father Boyle could figure out what to say, the silence was broken. It was punctured by Pedro's intense retelling of a dream that he had had the night before. In the dream, Pedro and Father Boyle were in a large, empty room, alone. And there were no lights, no illuminated exit signs, no light creeping in from under a door. There were no windows. It was complete and total darkness. But despite this darkness, Pedro knew that Father Boyle was there in the room with him, even though no words were spoken. And suddenly, in the dark, in that silence, Father Boyle pulled out a flashlight from his pocket and he turned it on. And slowly and deliberately, he shone that flashlight around the room until its narrow beam illuminated a light switch on the wall. No words were spoken, no explanation offered, no promise of a better tomorrow. Just a beam of light revealing a switch on the wall. So Pedro stood up, realizing that he was the one who had to turn on the light. And slowly, and with some trepidation, he made his way to the switch. He took a deep breath and he flipped it on. The room was flooded with light. At this point in the retelling of his dream, Pedro was sobbing. With a voice of astonishing discovery, he said, "And the light is better than the darkness," as if he didn't know this before. And then he said, "I guess my brother just never found the switch." Father Boyle concludes this story with a comment: possessing flashlights and occasionally knowing where to aim them has to be enough for us. None of us can save anybody, but we all find ourselves in the dark, in a dark, windowless room, fumbling for grace and flashlights. You aim the light this time, and I'll do it next. As Pedro said, the light is always better than the darkness. We could get all worked up about how ridiculous or idealistic or impractical Jesus' teachings are. We could spend years coming to terms with the seeming improbability of it all. But I don't think that does anyone much good. And I don't even think that's the point of this hard passage from Luke's gospel today. All we are asked to do is fall in love with this vision, where good is natural and love is our default setting. All we are asked to do is to notice the light that floods a passage like this. All we are asked to do is to pull out this flashlight and aim it around the darkness as best we can. All we are asked to do is trust that this light is true and better than any other way. Thanks be to God. Amen.